This morning we continue in the book of Exodus as we hear the story of God's people who have come out of slavery and are now in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. And so I want to give us a broad overview of how far we've come and remind us of where we are now. We have moved through the book of Genesis over the course of this summer, through the stories of creation, of God's salvation from the flood, of the first covenant established with Abraham, the promise that all of Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and that God's people are blessed to be a blessing. And so we heard the stories of Abraham's sons and grandchildren, all the way through to the 12 who were born to Jacob and his 4 wives. We heard the story of Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt, rising to be Pharaoh's right-hand person, and ultimately saving his family, his people, from starvation, and by welcoming them into Egypt to move into that region in order to survive the famine in the land. And then 400 years go by, and Exodus opens by saying, "There arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph." And so the Israelites had moved into this position of being oppressed, of being enslaved in the Egyptian lands, and they had cried out to God. And God, who hears and sees and knows and acts, responded to their cries in some really powerful ways. First came the plagues, and then Moses led them out of that slavery. Last week we heard the story of them crossing through the Red Sea on dry land and into the wilderness. So they are now in the wilderness. This is a place that they are going to be for about, 40 years. And I just want us to notice that, despite all of the amazing things that God has done, right? God has delivered them literally out of slavery through miraculous means. They get into the wilderness on their way to the promised land, and immediately they put on their rose-colored glasses and they say, "Oh, what, did you come out here to kill us with hunger? I mean, we were so well fed and well taken care of back when we were in slavery. We had all the food we could want and plenty of meat," and on it goes, right? And isn't that just like humans, right? No matter how blessed we've been, we are so good at focusing more on the problem at hand, aren't we? And so they grumble, they complain, and God says, I got you covered. I got you covered. Manna, 6 days a week. Literally manna is Hebrew for what is it? They don't know what it is, but they know it feeds them. And they're told to continue to observe the Sabbath that God establishes at creation, to collect just enough for the day, and on the 6th day to collect for 2 days' worth, because they are to rest on the 7th day. If they collect any more than that, it will spoil. So notice how God's economy works, right? Enough for everyone, but not enough to hoard it, right? And then there's the quail. We don't know if it was literally quails, it was some kind of poultry. So they are completely provided for. And, we have this tendency to think that in the wilderness places of our lives, that being in the wilderness is a synonym for going through tough times, right? But I want you to think about what is happening in the wilderness. They have a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Literally, God is providing for their daily bread each and every day. It is in the wilderness, as difficult as that place may seem, as temporary as it may be, that it is not their permanent home, it is the place where they become God's people. It's the place where they learn how to depend on God. They are formed and fashioned in the crucible of these trying times, even as they are provided for by God's mercy and God's grace. And isn't God patient with them, right? I mean, I just think about what might God's reaction have been when the first thing they do to get into the wilderness is they complain, right? Boy, these are some hard-headed people. And I bet we know a few hard-headed people if we're honest with ourselves, right? And so the important thing, one of the important things to think about as we think about what it is to trust in God, this was one of the things that I really was struggling with, because I'm thinking, well, gosh, these people complain and God's right there, Maybe I should get better at complaining, right? Maybe that would speed things along for the way I think the world should be put together. But of course, that's not really how things are supposed to work. It is that God is teaching them how to trust in God, how to know that God will provide for our daily bread if we are willing to trust God's mercy and God's grace in our lives. And the gospel lesson this morning, the story of the laborers in the vineyard who are invited to come and to work at the beginning of the day and several times throughout the day, and then an hour left of work and more people are hired, and they all get the same daily wage, right? For some people, this is one of the hardest parables that Jesus tells. Here's the thing. God's mercy is never something that we are able to work for or earn. God's grace and God's forgiveness are not about whether we served in God's church for 80 years or 8 years or 1 year or 1 minute. To God, each one of us is precious. And for us, the wages that we receive, which is grace and mercy in exchange for sin and death, we never deserve. There is no such thing as a person who has lived so righteously that we deserve the grace of God. And who are we to begrudge our merciful Father that he would give mercy and grace and forgiveness to all who would come? This is the nature of God. God's sufficiency, God's grace are there for us. Here's the thing. When we receive the mercy and grace of God, when we receive the gifts of God as God's people receive in the wilderness, nowhere in scriptures does it says, okay, now it's time to kick back and just, soak in all the blessings, right? That's not how it works. One of my favorite phrases that John Wesley taught was that grace received and not passed on loses its efficacy, loses its power. The original covenant was that God's people are blessed to be a blessing. That when we receive the grace of God, the ways that it stays vital and active in our lives is by us passing along the grace of God in our lives. We believe that when we give life away, we receive abundant life. This is the nature of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So as I said, I was struggling with this idea of complaining as I was reflecting on the scripture this week. And I had one of those, moments where God kind of put something in my mind. I had come upstairs on Thursday night after the finance meeting, and I was listening to the worship band from the third service rehearse, and I was thinking about complaining. And I know this will come as a shock to you all, but I hear a lot of grumbling and complaining in my role. And it's usually not firsthand grumbling, it's secondhand. Someone who's been the recipient of someone complaining will come and say, can you believe that this person complained to me about that? 9 times out of 10, they don't tell me the original grumbler, just so you know. I just get to hear the complaint, And so I'm standing here, and I heard grumbling about 2 things this week. One was grumbling that because we had gotten out of worship early last week, and we were early to coffee hour and had to wait for the Sunday school to be over before we could go in and have our juice and coffee, there was complaining about, the fact that we had to wait in order to get into coffee hour. The other was that we keep having crumbs in the sanctuary. And so I was talking about this with the father of one of the sweetest little boys at the 3rd service. He's about 1.5 years old now, and his father told me that every Sunday, when they say they're going to church, he gets this big grin on his face and he starts chanting, church, church, church. He cannot wait to get to church, right? We have communion every week in that service, and the children especially love having communion. And you know why? Because it communicates the grace of God in a way that is real to them and real to all of us. And so at the end of that service, I take the leftover bread, which has to be either consumed or returned to creation for birds to consume, or whoever, squirrels, and I hand it out. I hand out the rest of the bread, and of course the children are the ones who never turn me down for that. And at the end of the service, there are always crumbs. That comes with bread. And so I was thinking about these grumblings, and I thought to myself as I was standing here in the sanctuary, I thought, I wonder if complaining is in some ways a missed opportunity to live gracefully or to forgive small things, small irritants, we could look at those crumbs and say, oh, that is just hideous, and they haven't been cleaned up yet because we don't clean the sanctuary till the end of the week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or we could look at those crumbs and think, wow, what a gift that we have so many children in our worship service, right? And we are always given those choices. We're always given the choice between whether we're going to focus on the things that we can grumble about or whether we're going to focus on the grace and the mercy that is always embedded within them. And I think that's part of what God's people learn in the wilderness. And that's part of what God invites us to practice and to learn each day. And the more we can look for God's mercy and God's grace in the midst of crumbs and delays, the more gracefully we get to live. The more we get to see how it is that God is active in and around our lives in great and in small ways. It helps us to remember and to practice being dependent on God for all things, even to be released from being irritated by the small stuff. And I don't know about you, but in some ways, it's easier for me to handle the big stuff than the small stuff, when it's big, I kick in, I pray about it, I think about it, I try and be as faithful as I can be. But I think in some ways it's the small stuff that gets under our radar, right? Because we're not really paying attention to that as much, not really thinking of that from the godly perspective. And in this day-to-day living that we see the Hebrews figuring out, we are reminded that that day-to-day living is always an opportunity to learn to depend on God and to bask in the mercy and grace of God. I was also, as I was reading through, I read through an author this week who made this point. He said, the first issue to arise after the experience of liberation is how to establish a sustainable economy in this place called wilderness. And the author asked, is there a connection to the food insecurity that still plagues hundreds of millions throughout the world, or to the modern hoarding of wealth and opportunity by privileged people that more closely resembles Pharaoh's economy of slavery than the wilderness economy. Which raises the question, do we seek to live in a world in which we work for a place where everyone is able to eat every day? Or are we content to live in Pharaoh's economy, where a few have a lot and the many have very little? I imagine that if you are like me as it relates to disasters, you are suffering from disaster fatigue, right? We've had so many storms and so many tragedies in the news these past weeks. I can't believe we're up to 3 earthquakes in Mexico. I can't imagine being without power for months and months like Puerto Rico is facing. And I am ashamed to admit that although I knew that there was some type of famine looming in East Africa, I hadn't even bothered to really read that news very strongly until this author brought it to my mind this week. And I read in a New York Times article from June that 6 million people are right now on the brink of starvation in Somalia, and another 14 million in South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen. It is the gravest emergency that has faced our world as it relates to famine since World War II. And it's been going on all year. And until this week, I knew almost nothing about it. Now, I do not want to imply that the disasters that our own part of the world have endured are unimportant. They're horrific. I can't imagine losing everything that I have. I can't imagine all of the, lack that people are enduring. Well, at some level, I can imagine it, right? Because I can think about my own home, and I can think about, boy, that would be awful. It's harder for me to think about millions of people in East Africa who subsist primarily through their own garden plots and the animals that they keep. I don't know what that life is like. I've never lived that life. And so it's harder for me to connect with that. But here's the thing. People in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico are going through really difficult times and they need our help. But with the exception of the few tragedies of life loss that we have had, and those are tragedies, there has not been large-scale loss of life. Meanwhile, in East Africa, we have 22 million people on the brink of starvation because it hasn't rained there for 3 years. 3 years it hasn't rained. And these people have had to slaughter their animals because they can't keep them alive any longer, and at least if they slaughter them, they can consume what's left of the meat and keep their skins for some useful purpose. The desert there is growing because the temperatures are rising and the rainfall is decreasing. And I say all of this because as it was brought to my consciousness as I was studying this week, it became the kind of burden that I think that God invites all of us to become aware of, to wrestle with and to struggle with, and to know that this is not what God's economy looks like. This is the economy of Pharaoh. This is what a modern version of Pharaoh's Africa looks like. And so we, as God's people, are called to struggle with this reality, to remember things like the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, who lived on the same 29 pounds per year, $29 per year, and made 3, 4, and 5 times that by the end of his life, and gave all of the rest of it away because he believed that to fail to give that money away was to rob God by failing to care for the poor. That's a really high standard. That's a really high standard. And it's not one that I live up to, but it is one that I am challenged by. And so I want to invite us as we grapple with our own disaster fatigue, as we seek to understand how it is that we can be a part of God's economy, that it begins with prayer and awareness, and it continues with our own daily ways of becoming and staying aware of what is happening in our world and seeking ways that we can be used to live into God's economy of abundance. And so I want to close by saying that I hope you know that whenever God does this to me, and I feel burdened to share this sort of thing with you, it's really not fun, but I hope that it's faithful. And I hope that it's faithful for all of us. And my hope and my prayer is that, one, we will be so reminded of God's mercy and grace in our own lives, no matter who we are, where we've been, what we've done, no matter what time we enter the vineyard, that God welcomes us just as we are, loves us just as we are. And also remember that even as we are welcomed, even as we are blessed, we are called to be a blessing. May it be so.